Good morning, everyone. Can anyone hear me? Have you everyone had your coffees? I think academic quarter is about to end, so I will just start with introductions. Thank you everyone for being here. European Parliament for this venue, ΕΛΙΑΜΕΠ, and of course VIADUCT, the project that is EU funded. I'm going to say a few things about the program itself, and then we're going to proceed right to the procedure. VIADUCT is an EU-funded project. It's aiming at creating an academic network linking universities and think tanks from the EU, Turkey, and the broader neighborhood to build knowledge on EU-Turkey cooperation. Coordinated by CITIUS at the University of Cologne, the Jean Monnet VIADUCT was launched on 1st September 2017 and will run for a period of 3 years till 31st of August 2020. The project builds a large network with 40 partner institutions and one extended network partner from 36 countries. Represented in every EU member state, Turkey, and the neighborhood, VIADUCT is extending its outreach in research and teaching beyond the EU. The challenge faced by the VIADUCT partners are the EU-Turkey relations as a moving target. On the one hand, Turkey is seen as a key strategic partner for the EU. On the other hand, several interconnected crises are profoundly affecting EU-Turkey relations. On such crises, it's migration and the issue of identity. 2 years after the arrival of 1 million refugees and migrants in Europe, and 2.5 years after the EU-Turkey statement of March 2016, questions of burden sharing, externalization of migration management, and the future of European asylum policy remain along with the future of the EU-Turkey partnership on migration management. The informal policy debates of VIADUCT aim to foster policy dialogue and exchange of views among academics and practitioners on recent developments in both the EU and Turkey. This one is such a debate, a policy dialogue on EU-Turkey cooperation on migration, with migration being one of the main areas of focus of the VIADUCT project, and if I may add, migration being the main topic ahead of the European elections this next May. And so I think that the interest there is very big. I would say that probably migration is maybe the main focus of this pre-electoral period. A few words on our participants here. Mr. Ayhan Kaya is Professor of Politics and Jean Monnet Chair of European Politics of Interculturalism at the Department of International Relations at the Istanbul Bilgi University, Director of the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, and a member of the Science Academy of Turkey. He received his PhD and master degrees at the University of Warwick, England. He specialized on identities, Turkish origin migration in Europe, the construction and articulation of modern transnational identities, refugee studies in Turkey and beyond, and the rise of populist movements in the EU. His latest book, titled Turkish Origin Migrants and Their Descendants, Hyphenated Identities in Transnational Space, is available from Palgrave. Αγγελική Δημητριάδη, at my left, is Research Fellow on Migration at the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, ΕΛΙΑΜΕΠ, where she coordinates research projects on irregular migration, migration management, and asylum policies. Between October 2015 and April 2016, she was visiting fellow in residence at the European Council of Foreign Relations in Berlin. She received her bachelor's from the LSE, her master's from King's College London, and her PhD from Democracy University. Her principal areas of research and teaching are the governance of irregular migration and asylum policies in Europe. Her latest book, Irregular Afghan Migration to Europe, At the Margins, Looking In, was published by Palgrave in 2018. Peter Kövecsi-Oláh is a Hungarian researcher at the Migration Research Institute in Hungary, where he is mainly responsible for Turkey. He graduated as a historian and anthropologist at the Faculty of Human Studies, Loran University, and undertook linguistics and history at Bilgi University in Istanbul in the year of 2009. His PhD research is focused on the Turkish-Hungarian diplomatic relations between the two world wars. He was acted as a tutor of modern Turkish language at the Department of Anthropology and has undertaken research in the Archive of Republic of Turkey in Ankara. So, as you can understand, our participants here understand very well what this is all about. And I would like to start with Mr. Kaya. And this is a question for all three participants on what is the current situation in Turkey, starting from Mr. Kaya.
Well, thank you very much for invitation, Angeliki, especially to you. And it's really great to be here among many other friends. The current state of the refugees in Turkey is a bit actually complicated. To start with, Vasilis, in the Turkish context, the refugees have never been framed within the framework of crisis, because this is the way how it is framed in Europe, especially since 2015. But ever since the refugees started to come into Turkey, starting from 2011, the issue was not really framed as a crisis. But saying this, this situation is, I think, turning the other way around now. And to my knowledge, there is a crisis coming in. Because so far Turkey has managed very well to accommodate more than 3.5 million Syrians, as well as almost 1 million other refugees coming from the eastern borders of Turkey. But recently, within the urban spaces, in several different cities, the clashes between the internal domestic communities and the Syrians are erupting. We're doing research on such clashes, such cleavages, and I think one of the reasons why there is this growing tension within the urban spaces in Turkey is because of the fact that the discursive there is a discursive shift. There is a political discursive shift, meaning that so far it was managed very well because the government and the state actors have used rather successfully a religious-based discourse underlining guesthood, ansar, and temporary protection. But time goes by, and it turns out that many of these people are here to stay in Turkey. So, but this is also politically not paying off, especially in the electoral cycles. Even the supporters of the Justice and Development Party have clearly become skeptical about the high number of Syrians in the country, turning their kind of critiques against the government. So this is why we have seen recently in the Turkish context that instead of the discourse of guesthood, as well as the discourse of integration, because a couple of years ago there was a big debate about the possibility of granting citizenship to the Syrians, and immediately this caused a lot of resentment among the Turkish electorate. And now, instead of these two discourses, guesthood, ansar, integration discourses, there is a growing discourse of return. So you, in the national media, you will hear a lot of news about the return. I don't think that it is really to that extent to be a topic within the national media, but it's a political discourse, and the state actors as well as the ruling party is in favor of kind of reinforcing this discourse. So this is why I think because of the changing political discourse, the electorate is also responding accordingly, becoming less and less, in a way, tolerant to the refugees in Turkey. This is my starting part.
Great. I'd like to move on about Greece on Angeliki, about the situation in Greece. I'm going to ask a few questions, so we're going to finish at the first 30 minutes of this discussion with questions, and afterwards you can ask whatever you like.
Okay. Thank you to the two speakers for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here. So the situation in Greece, I think most of the people in this room are a little bit familiar with what's happening on the ground, thanks also to the extensive media coverage. So I just want to highlight a few points. I would say we're still very much in crisis mode, at least from the government's perspective. This is still treated as a crisis, although the numbers do not reflect that. In fact, nowhere near it. We seem to be taking backward steps as regards reception conditions, which is critical, especially when we're talking about the islands, but increasingly also the mainland. Keep in mind that for Greece, the management of the population right now in the country is a crucial issue, precisely because we still have a very centralized system, but at the same time, the centralization hasn't helped with the management, neither of reception nor of asylum processing. So I would also say there are backward steps on reception conditions which are important and crucial. There is a question of integration. What do we do with a population that is still in the country? There are some steps towards that. However, integration is linked to access to the labor market, which is linked to the economic crisis and the existence of labor market in Greece right now. What kind of labor market are we talking about? So these are still issues that are relevant and critical for us. And of course, there is the question of what to do with Turkey as regards the EU-Turkey statement, which to an extent, once the money runs out, the remaining 3 billion, there is a question of sustainability. What do we do? If Turkey does not remain a partner in this, then we're looking at an increase in arrivals. We've already noticed an increase in arrivals through the land border, where again, we were sort of unprepared for the influx. Again, the question of reception, but also of detention is prominent. And I think, generally speaking, Greece right now is a very good pilot, case study, whatever you wanna call it, to a large extent on what not to do when it comes to addressing migratory flows, and especially when it comes to addressing mixed migratory flows. The NGOs have probably been the most crucial partners in assisting as much as possible and as much as they were allowed, but we're still very much in a crisis mode.
Mr. Kövecsi.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's my pleasure to be here. According to me, the Hungarian opinion and the Hungarian discourse doesn't change much in the recent 3 years. So there is a clear opinion which the Hungarian government has since the migrational crisis since 2015, and we know that it's a great challenge for the whole Europe, this migrational crisis, but not just for Hungary, but also the Visegrad countries. The political independence is very, very important. So if we take into consideration that we are Hungarians and the Visegrad countries are free just after the Soviet Union collapse, I would like to emphasize that the political and economical and social independence is a very, very crucial point for us. So that is the reason why the Hungarian government is still against the illegal migration. But in parallel with the fact that we are against the illegal migration, we have several scholarships for foreigners, for example, and of course there is a program called Hungary Helps, which means that if it is possible, Hungary try to help for the countries and for the societies which need some kind of help. So yes, this is the situation in Hungary in a nutshell.
I will get back to you, especially in terms of the issue of sovereignty you are putting, national sovereignty, but I'll get back to it later. Again, this is a series of questions about the statement itself, and this is again a question for all the three of you. First of all, how would you assess it in terms of effectiveness and burden sharing? What is the key problem as regards the EU-Turkey cooperation on migration, of course, if there are any positives in that direction? And if you think that the EU-Turkey statement is innovative, and if it still is innovative, or it needs to be reformed. So again, let's start with the same row.
Well, the question is whether it is really a success or a failure. And there is not a straight answer to this. I think the answer could be both yes and no. First of all, it is a success. Looking at the numbers of refugees, illegal immigrants going across the Turkish-Greek borders. The numbers have drastically dropped. So in terms of the numbers, it is a great success. In terms of the number of detained illegal immigrants at the Turkish border, it is again a success. In terms of the Turkish borders being better sealed off, it is a success, right? In terms of the financial support coming to Turkey for the integration of refugees, it is a great success because through the ESSN and CCTE programs, humanitarian assistance programs of the European Union, more than 1.5 million refugees every month get €30 cash in their bank cards. And I think Turkey EU statement has directly contributed to the rise of the integration discourse within the state actors level as well as at the public level. But if it is sustainable or not, this is really a big question, and I think it is not really that sustainable. It is not a success in many other respects. In the first place, Vasilis, first of all, it has not made any change within the Dublin III protocol. So that is why many members of the European Union are not happy with the deal, especially Italy, as mainly Merkel insisted that the Dublin III will remain exactly the same. So I think EU-Turkey statement has, in a way, indirectly alleviated, increased the right-wing populist public reaction in many European countries. It is not a success looking at the kitchen, how it was produced. It was produced by a think tank, and it was introduced to Germany, to German Foreign Office, and then Foreign Office, as they did not have any other plan, they really embraced the idea very much. And then they talked to the Dutch presidency in that year, and then suddenly we have come up with this plan, and this shows about the ways in which things in the European circles are being handled. There is an intrinsic problem there, inherent problem in terms of the decision-making, policy-making processes within the European Union itself. And finally, I think it has, in a way, made many people realize that recently we are talking about a Europe of interests rather than a Europe of values. So I think, in a way, this, I would argue, has in a way contributed to the de-Europeanization of Europe at public level, and this is the way I personally see it.
In terms of values?
In terms of values, yeah, I mean, because it has also triggered the Eurosceptic voices among the pro-European segments of the Turkish citizens, because the deal was made in such a really interesting period of time when there was a lot of polemics between the Turkish state actors and the European state actors, Rutte, Angela Merkel, Erdogan. So I think it was unfortunate that it was made in such a political international context.
Let's hold that thought and proceed to
So, as regards effectiveness, I'm going to partially agree with Ayhan. Did the statement reduce the numbers? Yes and no. I think the statement contributed, but I think what reduced the numbers was the closure of the Western Balkan route. If the refugees coming in knew that there was still a functioning way out, I think they would have continued to come. And we noticed the reduction in the numbers already from January, long before the statement is put into place. So, yes and no in terms of the reduction. Also, it depends on what do we mean by effectiveness. Are we looking just at reducing the numbers coming in to Europe, or are we looking at this more broadly in the framework of migration management? And what is the impact also on Turkey? In my view, the statement was short-sighted, and it was a partial solution to a problem that will continue in the coming years. And I think Turkey is a very good example of this, because to my knowledge, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Turkey is already facing an increasing number of Afghans, for example, coming in through the borders, and they're not covered by the statement in any way. And there are questions of access to international protection, for example, within the country. So they are likely to become asylum seekers heading to Europe at some point in the future. We see the reopening of the land border in the Evros region, which is not covered by the statement, and again, there the question of effectiveness comes into play. So it's effective, but in a very specific and limited way, I would say, and its effectiveness is dependent on a variety of other factors that came into play at the same time. On the question of burden sharing, I'm not sure I would qualify the statement as burden sharing. The way that I interpret the statement is the EU gives money to Turkey for Turkey to retain the 3.5 million refugees, plus anyone else who arrives in the country afterwards. The resettlement from Turkey, the figures are low. They're nowhere near in comparison to the population that Turkey is hosting, which raises a question of, are we looking at burden sharing only in terms of financial investment, or are we actually looking at burden sharing in terms of redistributing those who are in need within not just Europe, but also on a global scale? Let's not forget we have the discussion on the global compacts right now happening, which affect the question of what to do with refugees. There is also the question that I raised before: how long will the EU be paying Turkey? The money is going to run out at some point, and the European Union is already committed in various funds around the world, including Africa, which is becoming a priority. Where will the money come from, and for how long will we continue to pay? But in terms of the question of negatives and positives, this statement has had, for me, a positive result. It allowed for cooperation to develop between Greece and Turkey on a bilateral level, which had not been very effective until then. There had been a bilateral readmission agreement already since 2002. It was not really being implemented. It was difficult for the border guards on the two sides to communicate. So the statement sort of created a framework of cooperation, which is important, and it's important to maintain. And it also enabled, I think, the EU to get a better understanding of how Turkey functions as regards migration management and what it's going to need in the future to continue being a partner in migration management. So in that sense, that's a positive coming out of this EU-Turkey statement. Yeah.
Yes, if we take into consideration the positives and the successes, we can also say that if we look at the numbers, we can see that the numbers are decreased, the numbers of the people who arrive to the Hungarian-Serbian border. So it can be considered as a success. A success is that Turkey did really a lot for the Syrian people living within its territory. In terms of integration, in terms of labor market, and so on and so on. So it is absolutely a success from our point of view. But on the other hand, there are still thousands of people, for example, nowadays in Bosnia-Herzegovina, who would like to cross and to enter Croatia in an illegal way, and the core problem hasn't been solved yet. That migration and illegal migration, people are coming toward not just toward mainly Europe. Let's say Europe. From that point of view, I would like to also emphasize that the Hungarian position a little bit, not a little bit, very much different. That for example, the Turkish position, because Turkey and Syria had common borders. So the Syrian and the Near East crisis affected very, very much Turkey and affected primary Turkey. So it is a very important thing that somehow Turkey would like to be active in the Near East politics. What else do we have? Yes, in this connection, we have to speak about the Idlib operation also. I'm very curious what Mr. Ayhan will say about this. Yeah, that's all from my side so far.
Before going to Idlib, just a last couple of questions for the EU-Turkey statement. Again, clockwise. If the statement indicates a stronger and sustainable EU-Turkey relationship on migration management, and if it can work, if it can function as a future model of cooperation with not only with Turkey but with other neighboring countries.
Well, Vasilis, first of all, I want to share one of our experiences in the field. Prior to the deal, we had a social anthropological research in Germany among the Syrian refugees. We interviewed around 700 people. And then the result was really, one of the results was really, for me, shocking, realizing that a very small number of Syrians were willing to go to a third country, a European country. It was like 1.5%. It was, I think, a representative study. It was shocking for me. I was expecting much more, right? But then we are back in the field again after, 3 years after the deal has been made. And our observation in the field is that the number of Syrians willing to go to a third country, a European country, have extremely increased, has extremely increased. Of course, there are many reasons why this has really been so. So the deal is not really a solution, It needs more than that. This is just an anecdotal evidence that we need to really think about. In terms of the deal being a model for the Mediterranean region, I don't really think that it could be a model. Just yesterday, I think still in Palermo there is a meeting at the EU level, and Turkey at the last moment left the talks because some, I think, misunderstandings or some priorities. And this also shows that this cannot be replicated in the other parts of the Mediterranean simply because there is not a modern state in the region. Specifically looking at Libya, there is not such a modern state apparatus that you can take accountable and transparent and reliable. So in terms of the context, political context, I don't think that it could be a really model. It could only work with Turkey to the extent that it could work. In terms of Turkey-EU relations, it has certainly brought an impetus. Especially, it has brought back the visa liberalization talks onto the agenda. Although things started very well, creating a lot of positive atmosphere in the Turkish public, among the Turkish public, but somehow it didn't really proceed very well. 72 items were on the list of adopting the process. 5 remained undone because of the coup, the terror legislation, and the corruption legislation, etc. So it has, in a way, made the EU-Turkey relations very alive for a moment, but it has stopped there. The second thing is this is also somehow being on the table, which is the modernization of the customs union. Turkish side wants that, but there is a big rejection from the European side. And we're recently conducting an EU research, Horizon 2020 research called Future, where we're looking at most functional spheres in which Turkey-EU relations can go any further. And then we come across with especially 4 different spheres where there is still a great room for collaboration, which is migration, energy, security, and trade. And I think Turkey-EU relations are so strategic and so important. It cannot really be just left outside the whole, the set of parameters. Looking at the discussions lately between Trump, Sarkozy, and Merkel about the establishment of the European army, etc. So Turkey is still there, a very strong, reliable partner to be respected, to be taken into consideration. It's not only about migration, it's about many other issues as well.
Angeliki, I think that Ayhan opened the issue a little bit more and entered in the domains like EU accession talks, and I will be very curious to hear about Peter's opinion on that also. Visa liberalization, customs union reform, and the voluntary humanitarian admission scheme that is on hold after the attempted coup in Turkey. So let's talk about these things also.
Okay. So as regards the whether the statement indicates a stronger relationship between the EU and Turkey, I think it indicates 2 things. First, that the EU has finally acknowledged the dependency it has on Turkey as regards migration management, and I am focusing here on migration. So I think for the first time the EU acknowledged that there is a level of dependency which pre-existed, but the EU had refused to acknowledge until now. It was time and again brought up by the Greeks, but they were largely ignored. The second thing that for me the statement does, it's for the first time it allows for a diffusion of restrictive policies and practices in Turkey. And I'm focusing here on Turkey's border management and the policies that they have undertaken in the recent years in an effort to approach EU policies and part also of the accession talks. So in that sense, the statement provides the foundation for a different kind of relationship and cooperation. I'm not sure if it's a sustainable one, because Ayhan very rightly pointed out the question of visa liberalization. So it has been dangled before Turkey for a very long time. They get very near it, but it's never offered. And it was the one major thing that the European Union brought to the table in the negotiations on the EU-Turkey statement. And the EU has not delivered. Not only has it not delivered, but it has consistently, especially since the attempted coup, highlighted that, yes, we want to proceed with the negotiations and with the visa liberalization, but you still have things that you need to do, and we're putting everything on hold. The voluntary humanitarian admission scheme was also put on hold following the attempted coup and everything that happened in Turkey, which was also one of the things that were offered to Turkey in order to keep the 3.5 million refugees in the country. So I'm not sure that the EU has been a very reliable partner to Turkey on this front, which raises the question of sustainability for me as regards this relationship. On the other hand, it is a relationship that must continue. We share geographical borders with Turkey. It is a crucial partner on many issues. It is a country that has always had a very critical geographical position in the migratory journey for those coming from Asia and Africa. So not only can it not be ignored, but it should also be taken very seriously as a partner, especially on the issue of migration. And I think the realization of the EU dependency is something that is going to, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I think it's something that was also noted by the Hungarians in the original stages of the negotiation around the statement. It's something that is going to remain a contested issue within the EU as regards the EU-Turkey partnership.
Yes, we are speaking about if it is sustainable, this agreement or not. And we are mainly speaking about the European point of view that we mentioned, and you mentioned also that Europe needs Turkey. It is, from one point of view, it is absolutely true. But from Turkish point of view, it is also very important to know that this whole agreement is not just about migration, according to my opinion. It is also a very, very important political agreement. Because if we look at the past few years, and if we look at the tabella, and if we look at the map, we can see that that Ukraine more or less collapsed. Iraq after 2003 collapsed. Syria collapsed. There are great and huge political fights within, for example, Greece as well. So if I imagine that I'm sitting in Ankara, I would say I would like to have some kind of agreement with the Europeans rather than to keep on fighting or negotiating with the Americans and the Russians. So according to me, for the Turkish policy, Europe to have good connections and important agreements with Europe is a crucial point, because there are a huge, I think, American threat and also Russian threat in the region.
So this was the circle of the EU statement issue. Let's open our vision a little bit and get into, I think, what is the heart of this problem, and it is the rise of populism on EU that we all actually know of, and in Turkey as well, as Ayhan mentioned in his initial answering in my first question. And how do you think that this would affect the cooperation in migration? And for my European friends here, I would like to remind that there are statements of prominent European politicians on stopping, for example, the EU accession talks. I think that Manfred Weber has already declared that, and there is let's say, an ample discourse on that issue. So, Ayhan, please.
Well, the rise of right-wing populism in Europe is actually something that I've been working on recently quite extensively with down-to-earth fieldwork in many different European countries. The way it is being handled, maybe Greek case is a bit different case, you know, because I also looked at Golden Dawn, which is really different from the other right-wing populist parties in Germany, France, Netherlands, Italy, etc. But this is also the case for Greece, I think. The way I see right-wing populism in Europe, as well as in Turkey, actually, you could also take Justice and Development Party as a right-wing populist party, which is actually one of the precursors of right-wing populist parties in Europe. There is quite a number of people who are becoming social, economically deprived and nostalgically deprived. I think this is the same for every one of us, because we are no longer living in the world we used to know before, right? Things are changing, and populism is really becoming very widespread among those people who are not really as mobile as we are, who are not really as middle class as we are. So the rise of the number of refugees in the public space, the rise of Islam in the public space, the visibility of Islam in the public space, the rise of those images and symbols which are foreign to us is making some members of the European public resentful. So unfortunately, refugees are not really helping this picture. So basically, we see a group of people who are becoming anti-refugee, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, not because they are really in their everyday life coming across these people. Mostly in our own research, we find out that Islamophobia is popular among those people who do not see Muslims in everyday life at all, who do not come across with Muslims at all, like in Hungary, like in Dresden, like in several other European countries. So then the media comes into play here, and there is also, we have also detected that the more people are trusting the mainstream media, the more they are likely becoming more populist, right-wing populist, Islamophobist, and anti-refugee. So the images in the media are very much also reflecting the realities of Europe with regard to the rise of right-wing populism at the moment.
Could you say a few things about how refugee crisis actually had an impact on this field inside Turkey? Yes,
in
yes.
Turkey, yeah. Well, it did not really have so much effect because if you're looking at Turkey, there is one party at the moment which could really capitalize on anti-refugee sentiments, right? That would be the Nationalist Action Party, Devlet Bahçeli's party, which is an ally of Erdogan at the moment. So this right-wing ultra-nationalist party is actually contained by Erdogan and the Justice and Development Party not to boost an anti-refugee polity, right? There are instead the other Social Democratic Party as well as the other right-wing party who are timidly from time to time using an anti-refugee discourse, but they are not that actually strong in the sense that they could create this very strong. So in that sense, there is not a convergence about anti-refugee sentiments in Turkey and in the European context. But if the alliance between the MHP and the Justice and Development Party comes to an end, this is my personal worry. We will also see a very, a very big anti-refugee sentiments politically mobilized by the MHP.
Well, we know about incompatible political partners in Greece also. Aggeliki, please.
Let me pick up one point that Ayhan said. You said there are no big anti-refugee sentiments right now. I think it's similar in Greece. Despite the arrival of more than 1 million, there wasn't a heavy anti-migrant or anti-refugee rhetoric. Instead, I would say the rhetoric was very much solidarity and hospitality, even though I personally disagree with how it was applied in practice. But nonetheless, that was the official discourse. This is obviously not the case, though, at a European level. I think we can speak of the rise of populism across Europe. I think we can speak of the rise of populism in countries that are critical as regards migration management, namely Italy. I think migration has been utilized extensively by the populists to both gain power, but also to pursue very specific policies. For me, the Italian case is the most problematic because Italy is an external member state. It has maritime borders. It is the country that has undertaken until now the most significant bilateral agreements, namely with Libya, especially before the Arab Spring, in managing migration. It is the country that is a partner in the Dublin reform, or at least used to be a partner in the Dublin reform. So for me, Italy is highly problematic, the direction that things are taking, and where we see how migration is portrayed and how it reinforces the populist sentiment. And what is of specific, I think, concern as regards the rise of populism and migration is the way that it's being framed. It's less about they're coming here and they're taking our jobs. It's what you said in the beginning. It's a question of identity. So suddenly there is this discussion of European identity, norms, and values. and whether they clash with the norms and values of the newcomers. And of course, the focus is on the Muslim populations, the focus is on Islam. So there is a religious element that is brought back into this nationalistic discourse. Suddenly, religion is where people turn to anchor themselves again to the nation state. So obviously, these are developments that work against migration, both in terms of migration policy at the border, but especially when it comes down to migration policy and integration. How do we integrate in a state or in states where the general consensus is that the people who are coming are different from us and they will not be able to integrate, and we don't want them also to integrate. So the challenge for me is when it comes down to integration.
I absolutely agree with you. My question is that what does exactly mean right-wing populism? So if we take into consideration that the people have a natural feeling, which is a fear, that we are fearing, or we are fearing from somebody who come abroad or who we do not know. I think this is not a problem. This is so it is not a problem itself. If within a society there is a fear, I don't from somebody which we don't know, this is not a problem. And of course, it is also this whole question is in connection with the self-identity. So I absolutely agree with you. But come on, we are speaking here, for example, in Greece. Don't say that in Athena, for example, or in Greece, if you say Turkey, it doesn't mean anything. Or if Turkey, if you say Yunan, or Greek, or Rome, it doesn't derive anything. So I think fear is a natural feeling or some kind of feeling. And of course, this is another problem or another question, that how policymakers use this fear. I absolutely agree with you on this.
So, okay, I agree with you. Fear is an issue, and I mean it happens. It's to be expected. It's natural. It's a natural reaction. But isn't it up to the policymakers and the media, but mostly the policymakers and the governments, to educate their public, their citizens, that what is happening is not unregulated, it's not uncontrolled, and they don't need to be so afraid because there is control, essentially. Somebody is controlling this. There is a system of reception, of integration, of asylum processing. There are systems in place.
Who controls this whole process? Do you know everybody, for example, the secret services in Greece, know everybody who are arrived from Turkey in the recent 7 years? Do you exactly know them?
I'm pretty sure that they don't even know most of the Greeks that they should be watching out for.
Okay, but it's another question. It's another question. According to me, it's another question. Do the Turkish authorities know who are coming into Turkey, for example? So I'm not sure about that.
Ayhan would like to make a comment, and really from now on, please, if anyone has a question or a comment or anything, just raise your hand. I know some people here, but not all of you, so you should introduce yourselves afterwards. And but I should
just very quickly, I talked about the political discourse in Turkey, which is not yet, hijacked by certain political parties to mobilize the anti-refugee sentiments. The second thing is that at the public level, there is a growing, discontent about the refugees, but which is also coupled with a growing Arabophobia in a way, especially in big cities. The visibility of the Arabs, not only the Syrians, but also the Middle Eastern, from the Gulf region, a lot of rich Arabs taking properties, lands, like here in Greece. So the fabric of the society is changing radically So there is this growing, what I call Arabophobia as well. This takes me to the question Peter has raised, is every fear natural? I don't think that it is the case. We are afraid of bugs, we are afraid of height, we are afraid of, certain things, which is normal, but then when we talk about the people, when we talk about the human beings, when we talk about the cultural, political, religious attributions of certain people, I think we cannot really talk about the naturality of the fear anymore. We should talk about the way it is being constructed and fabricated and reconstructed by a certain political style, which we call populist political style at the moment. And the final thing, Vasilis, is something about Angeliki has raised, religiosity element with regard to the rise of right-wing populism, which is interesting because right-wing populists in many European countries are not really among those, practicing Christians, for instance. On the contrary, right-wing populism is really becoming more and more popular, more and more widespread among those secular, LGBTI, women, atheists, agnostic people, who in a way need a new community. Because the religious communities, they already have their own communities to really fight back against the detrimental effects of globalization. So right-wing populism is providing many people at the moment using Islamophobia as an ideological instrument, what I call Islamophobism, similar to the late 19th century anti-Semitism, providing these people with a shelter, with a culturally Christian shelter to protect them against the intruders of the Muslims, of the intrusion of the Muslims or Islam or whatever you may call it. Thank you.
So just one last thing for me. Would you say that all the way that the European Union, of course we're talking about, Peter said right-wing populism, I would probably speak about developments in what used to be the center-right in Europe, because this discourse is no longer on the far right, but is within the heart of the conservatives in Europe. I would say that if you believe that the way Europe handled this issue, the migration crisis in 2015 and onwards, has somehow affected Europe's standing in the world, its normative power also.
Well, I tell you, I mean, for instance, just to give a specific example, the way the EU handled the refugee issue starting from 2015 has increased the right-wing populist aspirations in Italy, has increased the right-wing populist inspirations in Greece. Because individuals are rational, European citizens are rational, irrespective of wherever they come from, right or left, whatever. But they have realized that there are some, big pivotal countries like Germany, mainly interested in its own national interests, right? So this is the reason why I argue that this whole issue of refugees has been mishandled by, let's say, Germany, by Angela Merkel's policies in a way which seem to be Europeanist, but actually, in a sense, not really Europeanist, because it has not really contributed to the equal sharing of responsibilities at European scale, and increasing in a way the anti-refugee sentiments at the European level.
So I think it has resulted in a loss of normative power on behalf of the European Union. The impression that non-EU countries have is that Europe is willing to a very large extent to buy its way out of undertaking burden sharing and responsibility. This was obviously the result of the statement, and it's reinforced continuously through the various policies that come out of Brussels in the last few years. I think it has lost normative power also within Turkey. Ayhan spoke to this earlier. In the feature project, in the research that we did find this to be very clear, that Europe was not seen under the same normative light as before. And I think it's lost a little bit of its normative power internally to the people who, to the citizens of Europe who believed very much in the norms and values of the EU as the core of the Union rather than anything else. Now, on the other hand, there are the practical aspects, right? So there's normative power, which is important, but there is also the reality that some sort of policy obviously needs to come out to address the situation, and I'm referring especially to 2015 and the refugee crisis. But considering that Europe was exporting its normative position and its normative power, and it was using it actually consistently as a foreign policy tool, especially with countries in Africa and the Middle East, I think there's a question now, what happens when that power is diminished, or it is perceived to be diminished?
Sorry, what was the original question?
Well, if you believe that Europe has lost influence, if the migration crisis handling back in 2015 had an impact on its normative power in and out.
Of course, this is the question of the future of the European Union and the future of the members of the European Union, or the question of European integration, and of course, it is also the question of that what kind of Europe do we imagine for ourselves for the I don't know, for the 10 or 15 years. We will see. Sorry, I don't have exact answer, so we will see.
Maybe you have an answer for another thing I had in mind about what do you think about the disembarkation platforms in transit centers outside of Europe as a way of handling the migration in the future?
This agreement, the European Union agreement with Turkey, I absolutely agree with Mr. Ayhan that it cannot be a role model. Especially for the African countries. So from that point of view, we don't have any different opinions.
How to phrase this? I'm not entirely against the idea of disembarkation platforms, which is surprising, actually. I'm not entirely against it as a theoretical concept. So having, first of all, separating search and rescue from processing is not altogether a bad idea, because Dublin right now creates an overwhelming burden on the frontline states, and somehow we need to get past it. So having them disembark somewhere else for processing, in theory, is not a bad idea. It's a bad idea, I think, with this EU, because it would require massive resettlement and speedy resettlement from the countries where the processing was taking place. So the disembarkation platforms in third countries would be a very temporary solution for processing screening, not to keep people there. So it would require massive resettlement to take place from the EU, and realistically also a global resettlement scheme that is reinforced through UNHCR, and we're not in that direction. We're nowhere near in that direction. And it would require swift procedures. There's a question of who undertakes the asylum processing. It can't be EU member states. The European Court of Human Rights has already issued judgments on this. If any sort of violation takes place, then the EU would be responsible. And also there's the question of which member state. We don't have a common, we don't share positive recognition in the EU. We don't have one asylum system, so who would undertake the processing? So there are a million practical aspects in this, plus the financial cost that come into play. So as an idea, let's have them disembark somewhere safely and then transfer them swiftly and quickly and in a legal manner, in a safe manner, to the EU or other potential countries who would be willing to participate in the scheme. Sounds great. I have very little hope that we can do that at the moment, though.
Just very briefly, I think there is a really deeper problem, inherent problem with the ways in which EU is, handling the refugee issue so far. For me, the priority is the reformation of Dublin III, taking the responsibility, or at least sharing the responsibility with the Mediterranean coastal countries in the first place. Italy, Greece are number 2 countries here. And number 2 in the to-do list is to revitalize the migration development nexus, which was very actually strong back in the early 2000s. EU trying to make an impact in the in the countries of origin, in Africa, in the Middle East, elsewhere, trying to get the support of the diaspora communities of these countries in Europe, and also opening up job centers or other kinds of business models instead of disaggregation procedures. I think these are the priorities in the to-do list.
Great. Right now I would like to hear if there are any questions, comments. If any, please raise your hand and introduce yourself. Please.
Thank you. My name is Mark Allen, and I'm the ambassador designate for Canada. Thank you for a very illuminating discussion from 3 very interesting sets of perspectives, because each of you, tackled the question from multiple layers. But one thing I didn't hear was the global implications of the Turkey-EU agreement, and how it impinges on global compact discussions, but the broader rules-based international order, references to international refugee law, human rights law, humanitarian law. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. Thanks.
Well, it's a serious question to be really thought thoroughly. I need to think about this in terms of the global implications, so I will think about it. I have not an ready-made answer yet.
It's a tough question. I'm not sure it has implications for the global compact on the refugees, and I'm not sure it has implications for the compact because the way that the compact has been negotiated and the actors that have been involved, they seem to be very far removed from the regional framework that the EU-Turkey statement is actually focused on. It has implications for the region as a whole, though, because if you look at what happened in Palermo, for example, most of the countries that were approached to even consider beginning a discussion around the notion of disembarkation platforms and similar proposals, their response was, well, how much money will you give in exchange for this? So it has created a pattern which didn't exist before. And obviously that has implications. As regards international law, I think it's, to be quite honest, it's an issue that I think we will come up with in a couple of years, because I would be very surprised if the European Court of Human Rights doesn't end up with a case regarding the EU-Turkey statement and the returns. And I suspect this is also one of the reasons why we don't return that many people to Turkey at the moment. There are questions of whether the statement is a legally binding document. The Commission says that it's not. Turkey believes that it is. There are questions into how it was being negotiated, obviously. Ayhan mentioned this already. And it does seem to approach refugees as a bargaining chip. So basically, how much does a person cost? How much money should I offer in return for somebody else taking care of them or offering them protection? Which obviously is not the basis of humanitarian law, nor should it be. Yeah.
I don't have much to add. What we have heard just a few minutes ago, I absolutely agree with Angeliki that this agreement is or has much more effect on regional levels, than global level, and that's all. Yeah, thank you.
Mark, I've got an answer. I don't think that it really has positive global implications. It has rather negative global implications. In the first place, I think the way I read the statement is that it's all about numbers, it's all about quotas, it's all about money. There's no human being. So I don't think that there is really something positive to get out of this statement, right? In the first place, there are serious problems about the ways in which it was prepared by two leading countries, Germany and the Netherlands, as well as, of course, Turkey. When you look at the time period in which it was designed, there was mutual threats, really polemics. There were other terrorist attacks. In that, just prior to that, only in Turkey, there were more than 150 people killed in the ISIS terrorist activities. So it is a really unique, thing, a rather crisis management activity, which was not very well handled from the very beginning. This is my personal opinion.
Thank you, Ayhan. Anyone else has a comment, please?
Hello, I'm Rihanna Shakibai from UNHCR. I have a comment in connection with this question. The way I see it is that as a consequence of this EU-Turkey statement, the number of refugees and the most vulnerable refugees who need protection and assistance are being stuck in Turkey is increasing. So the impact might be the need for resettlement quota for other countries to help Turkey to cope with the situation in the region.
Thank you for this comment, please.
Yes, good midday. I'm Sari Nisi from the International Committee of the Red Cross, and thank you for ΕΛΙΑΜΕΠ for organizing this very important event on a very important topic. Maybe from the humanitarian angle, would like to bring an additional point, a simple fact that the Mediterranean route, whether it's the central, eastern, or western route, has stayed dangerous and deadly. There's over 2,000 people who've lost their lives only this year by taking one of the three routes. And only using the eastern route, there's over 100 people who've lost their lives only this year. And actually, the nature of the dangers have just increased if you compare to the numbers of last year, the number of people who lost their lives on this eastern route last year. So on the ICRC side, we are also, per request of the families, we are currently actively searching 300 missing migrants linked to only to the shipwrecks of the last 3 years. 48% of this caseload which we're working on are children. So definitely, I hear very well that the current times are challenging to find better cooperation, whether within the EU or at the global fora, but definitely there is a need for finding legal and safe pathways for migration. And more particularly, there is a need to find a mechanism to improve the collaboration between states, then to look for the missing migrants, regardless of their status. So, thank you.
Next.
Just one thing.
Please, sorry.
Just on top of what you have right now said, this is also our observation in the field. There are many deaths at the moment which are not reported in the national media or in the global media. But just being on the field, we see the number of deaths at the Aegean coast, Turkish Aegean coast, is really increasing. And especially, this is also an observation from the field, those who are at the Syrian border, because in migration refugee studies, we know it very well, theoretically and also practically, that you tend to travel as far away possible if you have the economic capital. So those who are actually settled at the neighboring cities like Kilis, like Urfa, like Gaziantep are the poorest ones. And just in February we did an extensive field research. It was shocking for me again to see that the number of people who are willing to take the deadly road, knowing that there is a big risk, the number of such people has really increased. So the deal is not really responding to any of these concerns, right? So this is, I think this is getting even more serious.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me and sharing with all of us all this valuable information and experience. I'm Sofia Didzikou. I'm former president of former Greek committee for UNICEF, very much involved in migration issues, especially concerning children all these years, but also as a pharmacist in a social structure in the center of Athens, in Omonia, where we dealt with health problems and medication offered to those in need among the refugees, illegal ones or registered. So I know from the field, let's say, from the humanitarian aspect, as it was mentioned before, this issue. It's very important here to discuss on this, on the next steps, on lessons learned, negative or positive lessons. But I would like to share my concern with you. We don't mention the reasons why people leave their countries, why we have 3.5 million refugees from Syria in Turkey, and millions of them from many countries all over the world, in Europe and all over the world. And we don't really question this important aspect that people leaving their country have a very good reasons to do so. I mean, it's a war. Or violation of human rights elsewhere. There are very specific and concrete reasons, and I would like really to know and to discuss about solutions in this direction. I mean, on how we deal in peacemaking, in peace dialogue, in establishment of peace in these areas, in the Middle East or elsewhere. So, of course, it's good to treat the symptoms, but it is very important to cure the illness. And the illness here, the disease, is very, very much visible, and we all know about it. Thank you so much.
Anyone else? Yeah, please.
Konstantinos Mazarakis, former chief of the Greek fleet. I would like to expand on the same issue and say that from my NATO experience, NATO is an organization that has involved itself in peacekeeping, nation building, all that kind, at least I'm sure about the level of the exercises that NATO very regularly does. And one of the major issues there is the distrust that exists between this military organization and the NGOs and all that.
Let's take one more comment back there, please.
Hello to all of you. My name is Yota Masouridou. I am a lawyer practicing in Greece, and I would like to give an input as far as a legal analysis regarding the EU-Turkey statement is concerned. The actual effect and implementation of this press release, because this is the legal value of it, it was published as a press release in the site of the European Council. So it meant nothing for the legal world until the 4th of April 2016, that Turkey started implementing and accepting returns from the Greek islands based on the EU-Turkey statement. That means that after all these years that this system has been implemented, we can see that in reality it initiated parallel proceedings for a return, that means deportation and examination of asylum applications in Greece only on specific territories, that means in 5 islands, in the islands of Lesbos, Samos, Chios, Kos, and Leros. These are the islands that have been chosen where special procedures apply as far as deportations, meaning returns, and examination of asylum application came into effect after this statement. So, in reality, there is no real cooperation between the 2 states, because the traditional bilateral agreement for deportations, that means readmission between Turkey and Greece, is still not being implemented. The numbers are very low. Only 20 cases were accepted under this bilateral protocol, and the money are paid by the Greek state. The opposite comes for returns of third-country nationals to Turkey upon rejection of asylum application in these 5 islands, where all of them, not only Syrians, all of them, and this is who this statement is covering. It covers all third-country nationals arriving in Greece and being examined in the 5 hot spots. All of them are being returned to a third country, that means Turkey, not their country of origin, based on the EU-Turkey statement, not by cooperation of the authorities of the 2 states, but via Frontex, a European agency, and with budget of the EU. Therefore, despite all the questions regarding the legal value of this statement, it is financed and is being operated by EU budget as EU agencies are involved. First of all, Frontex, who is responsible for the returns, and second, the European Asylum Support Office, who undertakes examination of asylum applications in these 5 hotspots. So, all this procedure is being financed by EU budget. And the most worrying issue is, since we are in the premises of the European Parliament here in Athens, that the European Parliament was not at all involved in all these proceedings. So now, what is the future of it legally? In reality, even now, we could say that the application of this statement through the EU agencies, that means through the European Union, illegally or legally, this is another issue, it means a collective violation of the principle of non-refoulement from all the EU member states that apply this, since burden sharing and solidarity are 2 very fundamental principles on the EU itself. EU was built on that, since the states are finding these indirect ways to get rid of their international obligations. Here we have a collective problem, and this is a legal question and not a political question. Secondly, politically, is the solution of the problem to send or keep everybody in Turkey? No. The solution is global resettlement programs. As it is, all the international community has to take responsibility, and the game that we see now, that it's short-sighting, we just throw the hot potato to other hands, as long as it is out of our territory, is not legal, it's not fair, and is ethically unacceptable. Secondly, what is the future? After we saw that this is a success, because in reality, the returns are not much, but the model that we have people suffering in these 5 hotspots was successful, so this is Europe, don't come here. So the next model is intra-EU deals. We see already the effects of the deal, the bilateral agreement, they call it, administrative agreement, between Greece and Germany to return back asylum seekers without registering asylum applications in German borders with Austria. Already there are 4 cases. The case have been already in the German courts. We are waiting to see if there is going to be a stand of the rule of law point in this case. Thank you.
Thank you for your points, and now let me hear your comments on all the questions from the last 3 persons.
Okay. Thank you. Just a few remarks about the fact that after the deal, the Mediterranean road has become even more dangerous. And this is one of the negative ramifications of the deal. And the other thing is about the causes of migration that we need to really discuss in more detail rather than the symptoms of migration, mass migrations. And of course there are many reasons. You have talked about the reasons, but there are also some other reasons which often escape our attention, which is the environmental factors. I can argue that even if there was no war in Syria, there was definitely going to be a massive migration, domestic or international migration, because Syria has been hit by a very severe drought between 2015 and between 2006 and 2011 and afterwards. So especially this part of the world, including Greece, Turkey, are becoming drier and drier and drier. So this is also one of the important aspects that we need to consider. In terms of the final point, yes, the returns are really low, unexpectedly low. I also agree with you that the politics of resettlement should be one of the priorities in terms of the assessment of equal sharing of responsibilities within Europe as well as at global level. I remember your Prime Minister doing a great show, accepting a family, which was great, but media communication strategies are sometimes working very well, and in the Turkish context, unfortunately, it is not working very well, despite the fact that there are more than 4 million refugees. Somehow they are doing fine. The other thing which brings me to argue is that with the deal, there is what I call the politics of charity. I mean, you basically give, a cash bank card to 1.5 million Syrians at the moment in Turkey, so that they could each month go and take 30 euro, around like 120 Turkish lira, which is great, which is making a great change in their life. But then again, this is a really interesting incentive which prevents these people from legally integrating themselves to the Turkish politics, society, culture, etc. Because they know that if they apply for legal work permits, they will have to give up all these assistance in cash and in kind, because they will be legalized. They also know that if they apply for Turkish citizenship, they have the right to, but they don't, because they know that if they apply for Turkish citizenship, they will have to give in all these possibilities of, charities. So this is why, I mean, we really need to think about some other options. Yes, these people have immediate needs, but then I think we are really beyond that level, and many of these people are here to stay, so they need to be integrated better. So this politics of charity is not really functioning very well, I think.
On the question of the causes of migration, yes, I agree. We need to be talking about the factors that result in large movement of people. But the problem is they've become very complex. It's not as simple as saying, oh, there is conflict, or there is an environmental disaster. It's much more complex. If one speaks with asylum seekers, they will put forth a range of reasons for why they left. It could be because they didn't have access to education, or their children didn't have access to education, because they didn't have access to healthcare, which they needed, because they were women, and in the society where they lived, they were constrained, they didn't have the necessary freedoms, because there was also conflict in their area, or in their region, or in their country. So it's a mixed group of reasons, and it's quite complex, which means that any efforts to address the root causes is a long-term project. It's not going to happen in 2, 3, 5 years, 10 years. If we want to be realistic about this, it requires long-term development, long-term involvement from the EU, it's a global project, and it's going to take decades to be even partially successful. And the fruits that it will yield will only appear in the medium term, not in the short term. And this goes also a little bit to what you said about the development migration nexus. I agree it needs to be brought back into the discussion, especially for the refugees, because the refugees are always left out of it. But there is a problem, which I think policymakers have now begun to realize. In the short term, development actually leads to an increase in mobility, because now the people who wanted to move in the first place can afford to do so, whereas before they didn't have the financial capital. So again, development works, but it's a long-term process, and it's an investment, it's a long-term investment, which politicians don't necessarily want to make, or don't have the luxury also of making, because politics is important when we talk about migration. It can't be left outside of the discussion. So as regards to the push factors, I would say, yes, you're absolutely right, but it's a long-term project. I want to mention very briefly, somebody mentioned NATO in the Mediterranean. I think you did. It's an operation that I personally find fascinating, because I didn't understand why it was put there in the first place. I understand that Germany needed a medium partner to facilitate the exchange between the Greeks and the Turks, and they thought NATO would work, to my understanding, the Turkish government has not been very much in favor of the continuation of the NATO operation. But it serves very little purpose in what it seeks to achieve. And apparently what it seeks to achieve is to deter smugglers or identify smuggling routes and smuggling operations, which is the mandate that Frontex also has, and which is what they have been doing, supposedly, in the Aegean for quite some time with Operation Poseidon. So NATO's involvement in the Aegean, especially on migration, to me remains a mystery as to why we need it, why it's there, and what services does it actually serve. On the question of the impact of the statement, you're absolutely right. Of course, there is an impact of the statement in the legal framework with treat and negotiate with the refugees and what their situation is, and that returns do not work. You're absolutely right on all these things, but I think there's a bigger question when it comes to the statement, to which you alluded to, you pointed out to actually before. The way that the statement was negotiated left the Parliament completely outside of the discussions, and Parliament should have been involved from the beginning. Parliament was not involved from the beginning because of the way that the decision was made. I suspect also because Parliament would not have been in favor of the statement. But that's a different discussion for another day. But what I think the European leaders have learned from the statement is they have figured out a very smart way of bypassing the legal processes that are in place in the EU to make such agreements in the future. I think the statement serves as a very powerful lesson how to do things without having to negotiate, essentially, with all the EU member states and their direct representatives on migration.
Yes, thank you very much for the comments and for the questions. Regarding the causes of the migration, I just wanted to highlight just one factor, which is the European responsibility. If you would like to prevent the wars in the future, we have to focus on the wars, for example, in the Near East or in Northern Africa. And if we take into consideration that the so-called Arab Spring, how the Arab Spring affected the European policy, we can see that in case of Libya, and especially in case of Syria, there are huge Western interest within this country. So from that point of view, I guess that the war, for example, in Syria is not a civil war. It is much more a war. And in this war, we have, I mean, all together, or at least, or mainly, the Western powers have huge responsibility. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. Any other question? The gentleman there, and after the lady in the hand. One question. Hello, my name is John Psaropoulos. I'm foreign correspondent for the Weekly Standard in Washington and Al Jazeera English. Two questions. One for Mr. Kaya, Professor Kaya. You talked about how EU decision-making on the refugee issue is perceived as shambolic in Turkey, and I think most Europeans would agree with you. But among Eurosceptic Turks, is the Turkish involvement in the refugee crisis also discussed? Turkey, unlike Europe, is a party to the Syria war. Unsuccessfully in 2015 in Chobani, more successfully in Afrin, which increased refugee flows both times. Are those policy choices questioned? And a question for Hungary. At the moment, EU policy seems to be moving only on the front of pushing the problem outwards through bilateral agreements with third countries. There doesn't seem to be any movement on common asylum, on relocation, even on the resettlement front. Is it Hungary's position that this is a viable way to proceed, that the problem can be solved without solidarity? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Till Gerards from the German Embassy. I would have a question regarding, we discussed earlier about the impact of the statement on the system of asylum in Europe, and that this would have a negative impact. My question would be if it's not rather, if the statement is not successful, that this would also have a negative impact on the asylum system in Europe. Now, at the moment we see, I mean, there was a part of confidence inside this statement, building on the confidence that when the people arrive on the Greek islands, supported by the whole capacities of the European Union would be capable of differentiating those who are safe and those who don't merit asylum to be sent back to Turkey. As we see, this is not the case. No, we don't manage to return, to identify and return these people in swift procedure. So my thesis would be, we see that it doesn't work, and the result from it would be to say, our asylum systems don't work. We cannot even let the people inside Europe. It's much better to have agreements with neighboring countries, with African countries, which altogether hold asylum seekers and migrants away from Europe. And frankly, that's already what we are seeing in Italy. The hotspot, no one at the moment would be confident to say, please, Italian government, let everyone in as before, because we have an efficient system with the hotspots in the Italian system. With the support of the European Union, we could have swift asylum procedures and return those migrants who don't have a right for asylum. So I would say, frankly, many people in Europe, maybe they are happy that they don't have to make their hands dirty, but they are quite satisfied that Italy is doing the job, and the people are not coming, at least not through the central Mediterranean way, to Europe at the moment. So for me, it would have been much more positive to see that we can establish these efficient asylum procedures on the Greek islands, what we have not managed to do so up to now. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Eftalia Papa. I am here on behalf of Church's Commission for Migrants in Europe, CCME. So my question, I have two questions. The first one is a little bit linked with what the gentleman from the German embassy already told. We heard a lot about implications of the EU-Turkey statement on Turkey, but I am struck not to hear a word from the participants, from the key speakers, about the implication of the EU-Turkey statement in Greece, on the implications on the islands, the hotspot experiments, the humanitarian disaster for which all Europe is speaking right at this moment. I don't know why you have tried to cover this under the carpet. We didn't hear anything how the EU-Turkey statement is linked with the future of asylum in Europe. And my second question is for the Mr. from Hungary. We heard from the other participants some figures about the refugee flows or the refugee population, respectively in Turkey and in Greece. We didn't hear at all how many refugees, asylum seekers, you have managed to enter Hungary during 2017, 2018. And if not, I don't speak about Kövecsi, that he has asked for asylum yesterday, about all the others. How many you have in Hungary?
Just let me allow, no one tries to hide anything under the carpet, for God's sake, but please, Ayhan.
I'll just say a few words about the first question with regard to the, with regard to whether the policy choices of the Turkish state have been discussed in the Turkish context. Yes, there is I think there is a big discussion. There has been a big discussion. Somehow, of course, these discussions do not really come out very explicitly. But I think one of the reasons why Davutoğlu, for instance, is no longer there is because of his miscalculations, his neo-Ottoman or some other kinds of aspirations. In the very first days of the Syrian civil war in 2011, you will also remember very well, Davutoğlu appeared on TV channels saying that, well, the war will end up in 6 months at most. And then, well, we will have open door policy for the refugees, which is great. And we don't really expect more than at most 100,000 Syrians coming in. And then resulting in the entry of more than 3.5 million people. So miscalculations. Of course, I'm not going to get into the other calculations of the leadership, political leadership in Syria. But this was discussed, this has been discussed, but unfortunately, for instance, there are other things that we need to consider. Of course, mass migration sometimes is a great key, is a great instrument to really make some changes within your own country, within the profile of the electorate. For instance, one of the things that needs to be discussed is the relevance of the growing number of Syrians, Sunni Muslim Syrians in the southeast, making a change in the demographic structure of the region, which is originally populated by mostly Kurdish origin Turkish citizens. So definitely it's a big thing. It will definitely continue to change politics, the way politics is being made in Turkey, so we will continue to have the ramifications of the massive migration to Turkey in the foreseeable future. The second question about the statement, it was rather a remark. I think the really key question is that the crisis has been there starting from 2011. And unfortunately, the European Union did not do anything until 2015, when the massive migration hit the Greek islands, right? So then there was a crisis management procedure, and the German government was not really very well prepared. And they said yes to the first proposal coming in from European Stability Initiative, which was in the end a great thing to do, but knowing that the plan was not really scientifically, academically very well designed, with a lot of shortcomings. So this is why, I mean, the decision was too quick. And I remember in those days, Merkel visited Ankara and Istanbul, I think 5 times in a row, right? 5 times in a row. So again, you will say that, well, EU had other issues. Yes, EU had a lot of other issues. And I will leave the third intervention to Angeliki, because I know that the statement has not really changed much the conditions of the refugees in the Greek islands, and the conditions of the refugees, to my knowledge, are still deprived. There are a lot of conflicts, cleavages, and the local municipal organizations and international community there in those islands are not really capable of really changing the situation for the better. So there is still an ongoing crisis there.
Thank you, Ayhan. Okay, so obviously we're not trying to sweep anything under the rug. It's just that the situation in the hotspots has been discussed at length in Greece. It's been widely covered by the media, and this was an opportunity to go a little bit beyond that. But to answer your comment, yes, the statement does have an impact on asylum in Europe as regards the safe third country checks, the compulsory admissibility proposal that is going to be happening now on almost all asylum applicants, irrespective of whether they are in the Greek hotspots or not. But again, this goes back to what we've been saying from the beginning here today, that the statement creates a precedent which countries, the European Union, and potentially in its cooperation with third countries, they will pick and choose the elements that they can adapt and implement in another context, and that's how they will move forward. The reality for me is that when the statement was proposed, and you've talked at length about how that went about, I don't think there was a realization on the side of the Europeans that there are structural deficiencies in the Greek system, which have very little to do with the statement itself. The conditions in the hotspots are horrific. There is absolutely no doubt about it. But is that the fault of the statement as a press release, or is that the responsibility of the state that is currently supposed to be managing the hotspots? For me, there are two different aspects. How we undertake the asylum processing is our responsibility. The conditions in the hotspots is the responsibility of Greece, and to an extent, obviously, of the EU, because it's an implementing partner and it's paying the money. Now, this framework, the broader framework of how asylum is taking place as a result of the statement, yes, it's the direct result of the statement. But I don't think Greece does not carry any burden of responsibility in what is happening right now on the 5 islands in the hotspots, and how the refugees are directly affected by it.
Yes, thank you very much again for the questions and the comments. The first question was regarding the solidarity. I like these kind of questions. I will have a question now again. Who decides what solidarity means? Who can describe what does exactly solidarity mean? This is my third question. Thank you very much. But to answer your question, I would like to emphasize that this is a kind of political polemic, okay, within the European Union. Hungary is not alone with its opinion. We have supporters not just from the Visegradian countries, but from some point of view from Austria and Italy as well. And in the next year there will be a European parliamentary elections, we will see this polemic is going on, not yet finished. So thank you very much for the question. Regarding the third question, I don't know the exact numbers. I have to check it, but as I remember, and if I'm not wrong, there were approximately 2,000 asylum seekers in Hungary in 2017 and 18 altogether. They are officially asylum seekers.
Thank you, Peter, and thank Ayhan Kaya, Αγγελική Δημητριάδη, all our speakers, and all your questions or comments were very valuable. Of course, I would say that this was an EU-Turkey statement discussion. The migration is a global phenomenon. It's not only contained in a discussion about a press release, as you remarked, but I think that our commentators and our speakers here would gladly have another round of discussion with you in the coffee.